Okay, so hi, everybody that's here. This is the Government Economic Policy Committee, the Concord Chamber of Commerce, and I am Tamara Steiner and chair of the committee. And today we have Aaron Sage, principal planner with the City of Concord. And we're going to talk about, or we're going to hear about kind of the RHNA numbers are down, which is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And those numbers come down to the local jurisdictions from ABAG that tell each city how many housing units they have to provide for, they zone for or prepare for in their next housing element. And it was a big number for Concord. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron and you can tell us all about it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tamara. I'm Aaron Sage again with the City of Concord, and happy to be presenting to you today. I want to thank you all for your time and attention to this important topic. Obviously, housing is something that's central to our society, to all of our individual lives and our families, to businesses. And so your time and interest in this topic, I think, shows how much the Chamber of Commerce cares about that topic, and hopefully you'll continue to be involved as our process moves forward. This is pretty much the same presentation that I gave to the City Council back in June. We gave them an overview of the housing element update. So let me take it away. If I can figure out how to advance to the next slide. Where did my mouse go? There it is. Okay. There we go. So first off, this is just an overview of what I'll be covering today. We're going to start with a little housing element 101 and tell you what is a housing element, what are the required components under state law. We will talk about the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, which Tamara mentioned. We'll talk about some recent state laws in the last 3 or 4 years that have really raised the bar on what cities need to do in their housing elements. And we'll talk about the consequences for non-compliance with state housing law. And then we'll talk about some project details for our housing element update. We'll look at the work plan, the tentative schedule. We'll focus in on community engagement, which is a really important part of the project. And we will talk about next steps and how the Chamber of Commerce can stay involved in the process. And I just wanted to set myself a timer here so I am respectful of your time. Okay, so what is a housing element? Well, basically, it's a plan for meeting the current and future housing needs of all income levels in the community at its most basic level. That is what it is. Specifically, the housing element is one of 7 required elements or chapters of the general plan, which, if you don't know, the general plan is the city's basically constitution for long-range growth and development. Every city in California under state law has to have a general plan, and it has to cover specific topics, one of which is housing. The housing element will apply to an 8-year planning cycle, which is going to cover from 2023 until 2031. All jurisdictions in the Bay Area are on that same cycle. So right now, not only our team in Concord, but every other city and county in the Bay Area, all 100+ jurisdictions are kind of scrambling right now to get on top of this and get their housing elements up and running and before their board or council by the end of next year, basically. The document must be adopted and submitted to the State Housing and Community Development Department, or HCD, by January 15th, 2023. At that point, under state law, HCD is supposed to certify the document and basically say whether it meets all of the state requirements. And if it's certified, then we've basically met our obligations for adopting the document. So these are the required components of the housing element. The first thing we need to do is we need to do a review of the prior housing element, or really the current housing element, one that's currently in effect, for basically lessons learned, have the policies and goals and programs of the current housing element been effective at meeting our prior housing production targets and policies. and what can we learn from that review and bring that forward into the next housing element. We need to do a needs assessment. Under state law, there are several prescribed types of issues that we need to look at as part of housing needs. That would include things like overcrowding conditions, overpayment, according to federal guidelines of how much of a household income is allowed to go in toward housing costs until it's considered to be overpaying or overburdened. Things like special needs, persons with disabilities, persons experiencing homelessness, large families, families that are headed by female heads of households, and several other prescribed categories. The next point is fair housing analysis. This is a new requirement that was passed in 2018, and it basically requires that jurisdictions look at issues of segregation and that is correlated to or based on protected categories like race and ethnicity. Basically looking at patterns of segregation as well as patterns of affluence that seem to be perhaps linked up with discrimination of any kind, and what the jurisdiction might be able to do to address those patterns. Next, we have constraints analysis. This is basically looking at what are the things that get in the way of housing production, both on the government side, things that the city can control, like our fees, our zoning policies, our permit process, and then on the non-governmental side, things that we really have no control over, like land prices, rents, construction prices, and market conditions. Next, we have the sites inventory, and this is a really important part of the housing element where we actually look at where can housing be built in Concord, what are the specific sites that are vacant where we could reasonably anticipate housing to be built, and then we have to do an analysis of what sites are likely to actually be built. Just because a site is vacant and zoned for a particular number of units, it may not actually be feasible to build there because the number of units needs to be a lot higher, for example, to make the project pencil out, or maybe that particular neighborhood is just not desirable for developers. There could be a whole host of reasons. So we're required not to just put together a list of vacant sites, but actually kind of go through those and do an analysis according to prescribed state guidelines of what we can actually count as a reasonably foreseeable housing development. Goals, policies, and objectives. This is where, after we've done all that analysis, we actually come up with our goals, sort of our high-level vision of what we're trying to achieve in the housing area, specific policies to help us get to those goals, and then specific objectives with measurable targets for how we will reach those goals and policies. And then finally, we have an action program that basically maps out, here's the different city departments that are going to be responsible for carrying those out, along with a schedule. Okay, so now we'll get into the Regional Housing Needs Allocation process that it sounds like many of you are familiar with. So this is a core part of housing element law. So the state has since, I believe, since the 1960s, when housing elements were first required, included this component of, not only saying you have to plan for housing, but you have to plan for a specific number of housing units that the state determines is needed for the entire state. And then the regional governments determine how that gets distributed within each region. So I'll go into that in a little more detail. The first point I want to make is that cities and counties and other local jurisdictions are not actually required to build housing units. These targets are really targets that you have to plan for. You have to show that you have a good enough plan. You have enough land that's zoned for accommodating the number of units that the state says we need. So that's the first point. As I said, the state, specifically the Housing and Community Development Department, determines what the overall need is for the state, and then they actually divvy that up amongst the major regions for the urban areas of the state. And then for the non-urban areas, they assign a number to each county. So what the state determined, I believe approximately 2 years ago, was that the state needs 2.2 million additional housing units over that 8-year period, 2023 to 2031. And the Bay Area needs approximately 440,000 of those units. And that's an increase of 135% over the previous allocation for the Bay Area back in 2013. So then what happens is that the Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG, is empowered under state law to develop a methodology and a draft plan for how the 440,000 units are going to get allocated to every jurisdiction in the Bay Area. Their methodology has to go to the state for approval, but once that's done, basically ABAG is in charge of deciding how many units go to each jurisdiction. So Contra Costa County, all of the jurisdictions within the county received an allocation of about 49,000, which was a 138% increase, basically in line with the overall Bay Area increase. And Concord received an allocation of about 5,000 units, which was a 46% increase from our prior allocation. So when you compare us with the overall Bay Area and with our county, we actually came out with less of a burden than kind of the region and the county overall. We also came out with a much lower burden than a lot of our nearby cities, particularly more affluent cities, such as Walnut Creek and Lafayette. Their increases were well above 100% in many cases. And I think in the case of Lafayette, maybe even something like a 2- or 3-fold increase over what they had before. And that's a lot of that is based on this new thrust that's been included in the methodology that's looking at high resource areas, basically areas that have better access to good schools, good public services, and also that have basically produced more housing, at least in terms of places like, for example, Walnut Creek, where they've done quite well in producing housing because the economics there are different. People are more likely to develop there because they're getting higher rents, but paying the same construction prices that they would pay in, say, a Concord or a Pittsburgh or Antioch. So that's part of the factor as well. Next point is that cities, counties, and HCD may appeal any jurisdiction's RHNA number. The appeal period has already ended. I believe it ended at the end of last month. And there have been 5 jurisdictions in Contra Costa County that appealed. Concord did not. We did not receive direction from our council to do that. So that appeal process will continue. It's currently starting up. Basically, it will continue, I believe, through the month of October. And then late November, early December, ABAG will issue their final decisions and then finalize the RHNA numbers. So we're going to be watching those appeals certainly for the nearby cities closely to see if there might possibly be units that get shifted around that change our draft number. Generally, we've heard that it's very unlikely for appeals to be successful, but we'll see if that holds true. Okay, so this table, before we talk about our current RHNA in greater detail, I want to look back to our current RHNA for what we call the 5th cycle, which was 2014 through 2022, and talk about the progress that we've made toward those numbers. So the first thing you'll see on the left is that these numbers are always broken down into 4 income categories. You have very low income, which for I think on another slide I have some notes where I can tell you what those income levels are. So I'll provide that shortly. But very low is defined as households earning up to 50% of the area median income, and that's about 800 units, and we've only produced about 2.4% of those units. For low income, which is households earning up to 80% of area median income, that's about 440 units, and we have about less than 1% of that category produced. For moderate, about 550, we're at 1.6%. And then above moderate is where we've done the best. About 1,700 units allocated and about 500 units produced. So overall, we produced about 500 units, or about 15% of our allocation. Okay, so going back to those income levels, so very low. Currently, that corresponds to a household earning $65,000 if it's a 4-person household. Low income is about $100,000. Moderate income is about $143,000. So once you get into the moderate income, you're really talking about more sort of middle class housing. So this is the 6th cycle RHNA now, compared with the 5th cycle on the left. And again, these are draft numbers. They may shift slightly by the end of the year. And this just breaks down the increases that we are seeing in those different income categories. As you can see, the higher increases are happening in the more affordable categories, because frankly, as shown in that last table, that's where not only Concord, but the entire region and the entire state have not seen the housing that is needed at those more affordable levels produced at the same amount. So I think the state and ABAG have adjusted their numbers accordingly. I thought there might be interest in seeing our current pipeline so that you have a sense of how we're doing currently on our housing production. And most of these projects, with the exception of the grant, which is shown in italics there on the 3rd row down, we will be able to count these toward our RHNA numbers for our upcoming housing element. The state lets us include any project that is where they have an application pending, or if it's already been approved, you can include that. And even if it's under construction, but it has not been finished by June of next year, you can count that toward your RHNA numbers. And then whatever's left over, that's the number that you need to focus on when you're planning for additional density and looking at vacant sites to see whether there's enough capacity to satisfy that remaining RHNA number. But as you can see here, we're looking at about 1,200 units in our current pipeline. We're certainly hoping for, and again, that number does not include the 200 plus from the grant. We're certainly hoping that more projects come in. I know that a lot of folks are watching of course, along with us, watching what's happening at the base site. And we will be in close discussions with the development team there to get a sense of what their timeline is for when they might be able to put some units, put some shovels in the ground and see some units constructed and opened for occupants to see if that might be possible by 2031. As well as we're looking at possible development on our North Concord BART station. And then we have the Coast Guard site, which currently is only proposed to be a rehab project that would not count toward new units toward our RHNA, but we'll see what the city council ends up approving there. If they approve a project that has additional units being added, we would be able to include those. It's important to note that we also have to look at the affordability levels, not just the total RHNA number. And so this table here kind of breaks down by income level how our pipeline units, where they fall in terms of the different income categories. So you can see even with over 1,200 units, vast majority of those are falling into above market, which is only 30% of our total that we need. And we really need to figure out how we can get more units built in these other categories. Okay, so let's take a quick look at some recent state laws. First, we have the no net loss. law, which is basically something that told cities, if you want to reduce the zoning, reduce the development capacity through what we call a down zoning in any way, for example, going from, allowing higher density apartments to allowing, only single family, that's a very extreme example. But anything that would reduce the development capacity is not allowed unless you upzone and allow more capacity somewhere else. So you have to kind of maintain your current capacity. Affirmatively furthering fair housing, I basically touched on that earlier. That's the fair housing analysis that looks at patterns of segregation and affluence that might be linked with race and ethnicity. More rigorous sites analysis, AB 1397, basically raised the bar for how rigorously cities need to look at vacant sites and basically prove that there is evidence showing that that site is likely to be developed during the 8-year housing element cycle. In the past, most cities would simply put together a list of vacant sites and, housing element after housing element, they would show, we've got, in theory, enough vacant sites to allow our RHNA number, but those units just weren't actually being produced. So, and a lot of that had to do with kind of overly ambitious assumptions, about what the market might produce there. And then finally, HCD Enforcement Authority. This is a bill that gave HCD at the state basically a lot more levers and hammers to use against local governments that are not in compliance with their housing element law, and allowed the HCD basically to refer a non-compliance issue to the state attorney general for potential legal action. And the consequences for non-compliance are pretty significant. Fines and attorney's fees could be assessed if a judge finds a city to be out of compliance. Those fines can go up to $100,000 per month on the first offense, and they can be increased up to $600,000 for continued non-compliance. If you're not in compliance with housing element law, you can be ineligible for a lot of different funding sources, including Measure J, our local county growth management plan, sales tax measure through the Transportation Authority. There's some eligibility requirements for those funds that you have to have in a certified housing element. In extreme cases, if a city is kind of basically thumbing its nose at the state can come in, a judge can basically issue a court order taking over or suspending our authority to approve certain types of projects until we come into compliance. And then finally, mandated approval of affordable housing projects can kick in if we're out of compliance, even if a project is inconsistent with our zoning or general plan, if it has a certain amount of affordable units. So pretty serious consequences. In the interest of time, I'm gonna try to breeze through the last few slides here. But this is basically an overview of the work plan for the housing element. We'll be starting with data collection and baseline conditions analysis to look at the needs that I talked about earlier. We'll be starting community engagement. I'm going to go into that a little more detail. That'll run throughout the entire project. The sites inventory, I mentioned that early. That'll become an effort that will take on the next few months. Policy and program development. We're going to be doing this where we come up with, we gather community input on policies to address these issues. And then out of that input, we will put forward, some proposals basically that would then feed into the housing element. But before we package it into the housing element, we'll allow the community to give us their feedback on what we're putting forward. Environmental review is something that is required for major policy documents like this, but basically this will be focusing on potential impacts of adding more development in certain areas. So doing a fairly high level traffic impact analysis, as well as other environmental impacts from that new development. And then finally, we will draft our housing element and then send that to the state, or continue to coordinate with the state throughout the process if we have questions. And then they are provided a 60-day review. And then finally, adoption of the document by City Council. This schedule basically shows those same steps kind of chronologically. In July of next year, July through September, HCD will have a 60-day review period before the document can come back to the City Council for adoption. Okay, so let's talk about community engagement. So the state law requires, quote, meaningful engagement with all segments of the community. And it does have language that encourages jurisdictions to really focus on historically underrepresented groups and making sure that they are really being invited into the process and have equal, if not better, access to give input. And we, in developing our community engagement plan, we targeted several types of stakeholders, and we held 8 listening sessions to basically get input from these groups on how we could most effectively engage with the people that they work with on a day-to-day basis. We talked to community and faith-based organizations, tenants, advocate groups, developer representative groups like the Building Industry Association, homeless services agencies and advocates, and major employers and business groups such as the Chamber of Commerce and the Bay Area Council. And out of those listening sessions, we formed our final community engagement plan, and we settled on these types of events. We're going to be holding a total of 6 town hall meetings. Most likely these will not be in person indoors. Our first town hall meetings are going to be next month on October 16th and October 19th. And what we'll do is we'll have 3 project phases where we do these town halls. So this first phase is visioning, and we'll do 1 meeting on the 16th, which will be in person, but it will be held outdoors at the Concord Senior Center in front of the building. And that'll be an open house format. And it's basically just to get people acquainted with the project and start to get some early input. We will hold the same type of meeting, but on Zoom on Tuesday, the 19th of October. And then we'll hold 4 more town hall meetings to correspond to those, to 2 other phases, one being policy review and the other being policy development, and the other being policy review. Listening sessions will be held again with those same stakeholder groups and any others that come to light as we start this process, to basically do a deeper dive with specific types of stakeholders on what are their concerns related to housing to be factored into the document. Neighborhood conversations are going to be more geographically based. Those are going to be in areas that will be defined as we start doing our analysis of where housing development is likely to happen. But we want to make sure that every area in the city is represented in those meetings. And then we'll be having up to 13 public hearings where we will be basically bringing information forward to our decision makers and starting to get their input, as well as giving the community a chance to speak directly to the decision makers and give additional input into the process at those hearings. The Housing and Economic Development Committee of the City Council, which is 2 members of the City Council, Mayor McGallion and Councilmember Bursan, that committee has been tasked by Council as the advisory committee for this project. So most of the meetings will be with them. We'll be checking in with them on a regular basis to kind of update them where we're at in the process, share with them our findings as we go through these different stages, and get their input and guidance, so that when we get to the city council, we're hopefully a little more on target with where the full council wants to go with this project as a result of that input from two of the council members. We'll also be holding a smaller number of hearings with the Planning Commission, since they are obviously involved with planning and zoning issues in the city. And then we'll also hold several hearings with the City Council, culminating with, of course, adoption of the final document. We plan to do a youth charrette, which is a way to get input from our youth community. We're hoping to include all of the public high schools in Concord in that event. We'll be holding several pop-up events, including going to Music and Market on Thursday of next week, and other events as we become aware of those. Basically, these will be information tables where passersby can get informed about the project, where we can just get the word out more effectively. Surveys are going to be a key component of this. We'll be doing those primarily online, but we may also do some door-to-door surveying in harder to reach areas that don't have the same level of access to technology. And then our media communication strategy is going to be very broad. We're basically trying to hit all the bases with that. We've got the 4 different platforms for social media that the city uses. We will be doing e-blasts. We will be potentially advertising on the radio in Spanish. We may do bus advertisements. And most importantly, this is where the chamber and other groups like yourself come into the picture. Is we'll be working with our partner groups to get the word out to their members. So that's going to be just as important as things that we're sending out directly on our own. So this is my last slide. I want to thank you for your patience. How can the chamber help? Well, first of all, any of you that are interested can sign up for project emails. I'll make sure to get a link out to your group later this week on how to do that. And that'll put you on our notification list for any future updates on the project. We'll be announcing all of our events through that list, through social media. We'll be sending out links to surveys through that. You're certainly invited to participate in those. As I mentioned, we've got the town hall meetings coming up next month, and the stakeholder listening sessions. We will work with the chamber as we did on the previous set of listening sessions, and you're invited to participate in those. Share this with others. As you interact with people in your business community and your personal lives. Please share the word and encourage people to get involved. And then finally, if you know of any potential housing sites, if you have any policy ideas, we're open. We need all the ideas we can get to solve this really difficult issue. So please feel free to send those to us, and we will package those up and carry those forward to our decision makers. And with that, I will stop and see if anyone has any questions.
Erin, this is Tamara. I put a couple questions in directed to you.
In the chat?
Yeah, but I can ask now. If a jurisdiction, a smaller jurisdiction, appeals to ABAG and is successful, what happens? So successful in getting their RHNA number reduced, what happens to those units that were reduced? Do they then have to get reallocated to other juris, so it raises somebody else's?
Yes, they do have to be reallocated because the state's RHNA for the Bay Area cannot be reduced.
I got it. There's been questions about that. What happens if a town successfully appeals, then that's at the expense of some other jurisdiction, because then theirs will increase wherever it is. And so that's really a resistance, ABAG's resistance to any successful appeals. I mean, okay. And the other question is, are shortfalls, I noticed with Concord and with most jurisdictions, running behind the 5th cycle numbers. What happens to those shortfalls? Do they roll over and get added on to the 6th cycle, or we just didn't do it? Or what happens to those?
I'm not 100% certain, but I don't believe they do. I believe that it's a fresh start, you know, on your new RHNA. I don't think that, you know, if you've been falling short for 20 years, you suddenly got this insurmountable, you know, mountain of units that you could never possibly achieve. So yeah, I think that you're allowed to start fresh. However, I think that when they look back, you know, and they see like, well, you've had a significant shortfall for the last several cycles. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have to really show us that your projections are accurate this next time around. And I think that's, you know, we're not the only ones to have big shortfalls. Everybody has. So that's why they've really raised the bar on the methodology and the assumptions that you have to have.
I have a couple questions too.
Yeah, please.
As always, Aaron, great information and thank you. So will some of the stuff where folks are getting to, for lack of a better term, build a mother-in-law unit on their property, can that go into counting some of this numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're referring to accessory dwelling units or ADUs.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. Yes, we are allowed to count those. We get to project kind of what an average number that we expect per year of those. We can look at past projections. We can raise that if we have a good reason to argue to the state that, hey, you know, we're making it easier to build ADUs in Concord. For example, we recently, I don't know if we've adopted it yet, but if not, we're about to adopt some pre-approved ADU plans. I think that's still in the process, but it's coming fairly soon, where basically a homeowner can just come down to the city and use a pre-approved set of plans. It saves them time and money, and you know, we're going to argue to the state that allows us to bump our numbers up a little bit.
Okay, so to go back to make sure that I understand it from what Tamara said and that what you talked about is, up until I think it was 2023, we needed to do something like 3,000 units, and now going to 2031, we have that number is raised to a little above 5,000. So that doesn't mean that we needed 8,000. That's just we're moving to the next phase, is we have to fulfill that 5,000 on the books.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. And again, we just have to plan. We just have to plan for that number. You know, we don't. You know, ultimately, if the state approves our plan and approves all of our assumptions, and we still fall short, we met our obligation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That just doesn't seem like that many, considering such a situation I feel like we're in here in the Bay Area with housing. But what do I know, you know?
Aaron, one other question quickly. In preparing the projections this time, the SB 9 is going to change the game. How are you going to estimate the number of units produced by people exercising their rights under SB 9? How are you? I mean, that's all new territory. There's nothing to base it on. Hope.
There is actually something to base it on. The Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley did a study earlier this year, actually calculating the number of units that they anticipated could be added under SB 9. Mm. They actually broke it down by city, and I don't want to throw out a number because I don't have it right in front of me, so I don't want to give you the wrong number. But
is that study available? Do you have a link to it?
Yeah, I can certainly share that. It is basically a theoretical maximum number. Right. So what they were careful. I just attended a webinar about this yesterday. They were careful to stress that, you know, individual homeowners and investors are going to make their own decisions. Not everybody's going to go forward and build or split their lot just because it's theoretically feasible. So our work is going to be to, you know, build upon their analysis and try to drill down to like what we could tell the state is a reasonable assumption of what might actually get built. But yeah, there's been some work done there, and there needs to be some more.
Any other questions for Aaron? No? Great. Well, thank you, Aaron, for coming and talking about this. It's definitely some good information that'll impact Concord and good for all of us to know. So we appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Please reach out if you have any further questions.
And we'll be sure to include Aaron's information when we send out the contact list. So if anyone has any questions afterwards, you can always email him and he'll respond.
Great. Thank you, Melissa.
Of course.
Thanks.
Let's see. Mike, do you have any updates that you would like to share? I see you on here.
Happy to share a few. We were happy to get through the end of session on September 10th, I believe. All the dates start to run together after a little while, but we were very happy to be able to pass 9 bills in total this year to the governor's desk, 3 of which have been signed. So we're looking forward to hopefully having all remaining 6 signed, which would be a phenomenal track record. Considering the current condition and pandemic, the Assembly member has not stopped and he's not taking a break or vacation, but is continuing to work very hard and going with the theme of this Government Affairs Committee meeting. He is spending a significant portion of what is called the interim recess working on more housing issues. So there is a housing tour that is going through the state that the Assembly member is part of and is bringing together stakeholders, developers, all sorts of different parties in the housing world to see what are some of the hindrances in production of housing in California, which has traditionally been a challenge, and how there are ways that can address those without becoming too overbearing on any one single party. So that is something that is a listening tour, and we are hoping to be able to gain some good information to sort of guide legislation as it goes through next year. Also involved in some energy and labor listening tours as we start to move towards an energy transition from fossil fuels to more clean sources. There are a lot of dynamics that go into that, including jobs and economic considerations. So we are doing some tours with stakeholders in those industries and areas to find out what are ways that we can make that transition feasible and smooth. So those are 2 larger issues that the Assembly member is working on. This past week, we had a select committee hearing highlighting an increase in interpersonal violence throughout the pandemic, really trying to focus and spotlight a need that has come through as the pandemic took its tolls on people's lives. We saw an increase in interpersonal violence, so trying to make sure that that is highlighted and known and not hidden away, trying to make sure that people have access to resources. So those are all things that the Assembly member has worked on in the last couple of weeks and is continuing to work on through the remainder of the year. So happy to take questions. Although there is no session, our office doors are still open to the public by appointment. Our phones are working, our emails are working, and we're happy to take questions and answer anything that we can and get back to constituents. So please feel free to reach out. Always happy to listen and engage. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. All right, on the chamber side, we do have 2 ribbon cuttings coming up. One is tomorrow at 3:30 at Office Evolution, located above McCooney at the veranda. And we have one next Wednesday at Huckleberry's Breakfast and Lunch, located on Treat Boulevard. That is the 29th at 9 a.m. So if you don't mind, if you plan on attending, please register for those events just so we have a head count so we know who's coming. And with that, that's all we have from the chamber, unless anyone has any other questions for us or any announcements that you'd like to make. We'll get you guys out a little bit early.
Let's see, next month is
We have,
October.
yes, we have Deborah Allen from BART coming to speak next month.
Right. And then in November, we have Confire, but we don't know who yet, but Steve Hill, the PIO, has committed to providing a speaker for the November meeting. I mean, basically the impacts of the Confire consolidation, or it's more as an annexation of East County Fire and hopefully Rodeo Hercules. So living out East County Fire District, we're very happy.
All right, keep a lookout for all those events. We do have everything on the website. If you have any questions, you guys know where to find us. Thank you again to Aaron for taking time to speak to our group. This is recorded, so if anyone wants to rewatch it, it'll be on Facebook and our YouTube once I get it up on YouTube. So all of our information lives there, so you can always rewatch those and gather some good information. And with that, 10 minutes left, we'll get you guys out a little bit early. Thank
Hold
you,
on,
everyone.
quickly, if anybody has any topics or questions that they want to see addressed by the committee in 2022, we're not going to have a meeting in December, but in 2022, please pass them on, because we're working on at least the first January, February, March. And Mike, that includes you.
All right. Thank you, Tamara,
Nice
for
plug,
that.
Tamara.
Great idea. All right, everyone. I hope you have a great night,
you.
and we'll see
Stay
you
cool.
soon.